every idea that claims to have a representation, to be a representation of truth, is always reduced in its reality by the fact that it is held by a person with a perspective. There is never an absolute view on truth. There is no view from nowhere. Or there is no God's eye view perspective on the world in reality, because everything comes down to a human perspective. And the thing with that is, a perspective is never... Human beings never have one unified perspective. There's always a whole lot of different perspectives, and the world appears in different ways based on which one of those perspectives you happen to be sitting in at the present. So, for instance, when you're hungry, the world kind of stands in front of you as a bunch of ways to get food and obstacles to get food. And when you're hungry, that feels like how the world actually is. Like, you think of the world as being made of food and obstacles to food. But then if you're trying to do, I don't know, you're a physicist and you're trying to understand science, well, then understand the laws of nature, then the world presents itself to you in that way. It's a bunch of material processes. They have an internal code that dictates the behavior that you see in the appearance. And whatever perspective you happen to be sitting in at present always has this air of finality. It feels that is the fundamental perspective. And I think this is really the idea of poststructuralism, is to recognize that whatever perspective you have, it has this limitation. That you're taking whatever, even though you might feel very, very certain that something is true, it always relies not necessarily on assumptions per se, but on a view of the world, like on a perspective of the world that you do assume. That it's kind of like an assumption. You're viewing the world in a certain way, and you're taking your deductions and your analysis of it based on this basic view, which is arbitrary. Or it's not arbitrary because perspectives are legitimate, but it's not universal, and that's the main thing to recognize. So that even if you've analyzed the world in a perfectly logical and perfectly empirical way, you're still, in order to get started at all, you have to cast the world in a certain way. Now, so I think there's that limitation on truth, because, I mean, just to ram the point home, whenever I think that I have the truth, I always only have actually a perspective on truth. There will come some time, there will come some experience where I'll look back at my most certainly held conviction and realize that it's not absolute. It's conditional upon other things. I only recognize after I'm out of that attitude. But what is true, or another way that perspectives can be mediated, rather than by appeal to the absolute truth, because that's what we're thinking up until recently has been, if I have one perspective one day and one perspective another day, and I'm trying to compare my perspective with those of another person, we should all be, we should decide based on the actual external world, or our closest estimation to the external world. That's what's going to mediate the decision. That's what's going to help us to decide which of the various theories or perspectives is more legitimate. But the thing is, as I say, there's a limitation to what we conjecture as being actual reality, so that it doesn't really function as a measure, because it's so prone. It has this hole in it. It has this missing connection. But what remains is that there's this psychological fact of human beings, that the feeling of having our perspectives aligned is a natural good. And I feel like all the terms that I'm using to describe this fact, kind of, they fall prey to the same problem that I've just explained, in that they all have assumptions about the world. But I think any person can look into themselves and ask themselves if it's true of them, that the feeling of having your different perspectives aligned doesn't feel necessarily good. Maybe that's not the right word, but it just, there's some kind of natural development process that's going on where you're I think that the idea of desire here is wrong, but there is a nature to it's some kind of natural unfolding process where your perspectives become in alignment with each other. And I think that is another mediating principle. So that, if I see the world one day based on a physics perspective, and then I have a spiritual experience the next day, and I see the world based on that perspective, I could try and use reason to mediate, to decide which of those is better, or to figure out how to fit them together properly. But I think there's another way of mediating them, of the perspectives, which is the fact that there's this inherent nature of human consciousness where it's always good to have, there's a natural attraction, a natural orienting principle that causes the perspectives to come into alignment with each other, so that there isn't a logical reason to fit them together, but that they can coexist without causing any problems, and that this is just it's a second thing. It's not the same thing as reason, but it has the same effect of bringing things into alignment. So that's I guess maybe a response to post-structuralism, or this death of absolute truth, the failure of the Enlightenment, is to say that, okay, there isn't an absolute world out there that can mediate things, but there is a human nature that causes mediation. And whether you believe that it exists or not is up to you. And there's really no way that I can prove that it does or does not exist. It's just a question you kind of have to ask yourself. But I think it does. So just to end, I would say that in terms of how that affects larger scale social negotiation and cultural foundations or political systems, I think any structure or social or organization that comes from the top down, that is the result of a theory, is always going to rely on some notion of human nature in order. So you're going to say humans are this way, and here's how we're going to set up the society so that humans can function properly. But that's going to be one myopic perspective. There's always going to, your concept of human nature is going to be one of these totalizing myopic perspectives that claims finality to itself. And so that whenever you institute a sort of social program, you're going to end up with this problem where it relies on the Enlightenment notion of truth, which is lost. But that's not to say that there can't be large-scale social coherence. I just think that it's going to require influence by the second mediating principle, which is that there's a nature of a human desire to feel the alignment of perspectives as being a good thing. And that happens on a individual level. The perspectives within yourself, you can feel to be aligned or not, and you can feel the alignment to be good. But then when you interact with other people, you can also feel that same situation happening. That you have a bunch of various perspectives, various motivations that are at odds when you're with another person. And there's just a natural, organic process where they want to come into alignment. But that it's impossible for that to take place from the top down. So that now that we're in this transition stage for all human culture, I think the solution is going to have to happen on this internal, individual stage in reference to this other type of mediating principle that is not reason, but is something else.